The reproductive revolution, selection pressure in a post-Darwinian world. Here are 3 predictions about life 1,000 years from now. 1. Suffering of any kind will be biologically impossible. Our descendants will lead lives of genetically pre-programmed bliss whose worst lows surpass today's peak experiences. 1,000 years hence, the heritable hedonic set point of ordinary waking life would have been ratcheted upwards so that everyday existence feels sublime. 2. Our genetically enhanced successors won't grow old and die, but will be effectively immortal, barring accidents which mean certain brains have to be restored from digital backup. 3. Post-humans will be innately smarter than us, not just in the narrow autistic sense of intelligence measured by contemporary IQ tests, but a more empathetic intelligence. To use a non-scientific term, our descendants will be wiser than contemporary humans. These are bold claims. They could of course be completely wrong. Futurology doesn't have a brilliant track record. However, I'm going to argue why these 3 seemingly unrelated developments, super happiness, super longevity and super intelligence, are intimately linked. We are on the brink of a revolution in reproductive medicine, the coming era of designer babies, a fundamental transition in the evolution of life in the universe. Evolution will shortly cease to be blind and random, as it has been for the past 4 billion years. Instead, intelligent agents are going to choose and design genotypes in anticipation of their likely behavioral and psychological effects. Specifically, prospective parents will increasingly choose the genetic makeup of their future children rather than playing genetic roulette. Natural selection is going to be replaced by unnatural selection. But first, I want to outline a very different bioconservative vision, perhaps best represented today by the distinguished geneticist at University College London, Professor Steve Jones. So, 2 contrasting views of future human evolution. 1. Bioconservatism, or the end of evolution. Quote, "If you want to know what utopia is like, just look around, this is it," end quote, says Professor Jones in a Royal Society debate in Edinburgh. In a talk entitled "Is Evolution Over?", Professor Jones says, quote, "Things have simply stopped getting better or worse for our species," end quote. Professor Jones explains how there are 3 components to human evolution: natural selection, mutation, and random change. Quote, "Quite unexpectedly, we have dropped the human mutation rate because of a change in reproductive patterns. In ancient times, half our children would have died by the age of 20. Now, in the Western world, 98% of them are surviving to 21, quote, says Professor Jones in a recent interview with The Times. The mutation rate is also slowing down. Although chemicals and radioactive pollution could cause genetic changes, one of the most important mutation triggers was advanced age in men. Quote, "Perhaps surprisingly, the age of reproduction has gone down. The mean age of male reproduction means that most conceive no children after the age of 35. Fewer older fathers means that, if anything, mutation is going down," end quote. It's worth adding that some scientists and right-wing commentators go further than Steve Jones. They argue that because allegedly more intelligent people have fewer children than allegedly less intelligent people, then the intelligence of the human species as a whole is actually going to decline. This prediction isn't borne out by the long-term increase in IQ scores over the last century, the Flynn effect. However, believers in the so-called dysgenic fertility hypothesis counter that it is possible for genotypic IQ to decline even while phenotypic IQ rises throughout the population, at least in the short run. They explain this paradox by environmental effects such as better schooling, improved nutrition, and even television viewing. By contrast to the bioconservative perspective, to biorevolution, human evolution is about to accelerate. Selection pressure isn't going to slacken. On the contrary, we're on the eve of an era of unnatural or artificial selection, a different kind of selection pressure, but a selection pressure that will be extraordinarily intense, favouring a very different set of adaptations and traits that were genetically adaptive in the ancestral environment on the African savanna. Let's quickly review some background. The Human Genome Project was the international scientific project that aimed to determine the sequence of chemical base pairs of our DNA, the genetic makeup of our species. Researchers identified, physically and functionally, the 25,000 or so genes of the human genome. The Human Genome Project was formally declared complete to a 99.99% accuracy in 2003, though in reality there are a lot of loose ends to be tied up. The full implications of our deciphered code have been scarcely glimpsed. They may take centuries to unravel. Currently, if you want your whole genome of 3 billion odd base pairs sequenced, the price is several $100,000. This figure is prohibitively expensive for most people. But in a decade or so, the cost on some estimates could be as little as $10. Whatever the exact price or timing, the cost of access to one's own source code is poised to collapse. Routine access to one's personal genome will usher in an era of personalized medicine. Individual drugs, dosages and gene therapies targeted at the individual rather than the scattergun approach we see in clinical pharmacology and recreational drug use today. If we're not just heading for an era of personalized medicine, we're on the eve of an era of personalized reproductive medicine, designer babies to use the popular term. The phrase suggests something frivolous akin to designer clothes, but choosing the genetic makeup of your child may soon become the badge of responsible parenthood, as distinct from throwing the genetic dice and hoping they roll the right way as now. A reluctance to pass on harmful code to our children won't just apply to obvious autosomal dominant conditions like the neurological disorder Huntington's disease. What prospective parent, if offered the choice, is deliberately going to pass on genes for haemophilia, sickle cell anemia, or muscular dystrophy? It's been estimated that on average we each carry 4 lethal recessive genes. In a future of post-genomic reproductive medicine, the selection pressure against, say, the cystic fibrosis allele, the cause of the most common life-limiting autosomal recessive disease amongst people of European heritage, is going to become intense, as indeed is selection pressure against a whole range of genes that cause or contribute to physical disease. Currently, we're used to Googling prospective partners on the net to find out more about them. Looking ahead, what prospective parent will neglect to check their partner's DNA and their own before having children? This doesn't mean that anyone who wants a child will reject an asymptomatic partner who carries a recessive copy of a nasty gene. Instead, responsible parents can use pre-implantation genetic diagnosis and germline gene therapy to ensure that potentially harmful genes like the recessive cystic fibrosis allele aren't passed on to their children. Genetic rewrite versus designer babies. Yet how about heritable psychological traits, personality genes that contribute to psychological pain? Not merely is there no consensus on whether some of their less pleasant variants should be classed as pathological, here too things are much more complex, technically, than for monogenic disorders like cystic fibrosis. This is because there is no such thing as a single gene for depression or anxiety disorders or jealousy or for obsessive-compulsive disorder and so forth. But there are alleles and genotypes that predispose to depression or anxiety or jealousy or obsessive-compulsive disorder and other polygenic, multifactorial psychological conditions. So if there is a particular allele, a variant gene, that makes it, say, 5% more likely that a particular trait such as low mood or chronic anxiety will be expressed, or an allele that makes its bearer 5% more or less anxious or more depressive, then what percentage of prospective parents will purposely choose the less pleasant variant for their children? Yes, there are numerous complications, for instance pleiotropy, where a single gene influences multiple phenotypic traits, alternative splicing, whereby a single gene may produce different proteins in different settings, genomic imprinting, a parent-dependent form of gene expression, non-Mendelian inheritance in the form of transgenerational epigenetic effects and so forth. More generally, critics of the new genetic medicine worry about creating designer personalities. Other things being equal, however, most informed parents will presumably choose the more compassionate option for their child. Indeed, one Oxford professor of ethics goes further. Julian Sivanescu argues that we are morally obligated to select genetic blueprints for our children with the greatest chance of leading the best life, what Professor Sivanescu dubs the principle of procreative beneficence. This conjecture isn't premature. For example, people who inherit 2 copies of a short version of the chromosome 17 serotonin transporter gene, 5-HTT-LPR, have an 80% chance of becoming clinically depressed if they experience 3 or more negative life events in 5 years. By contrast, genetically resilient people who inherit the long version have only a 30% chance of developing mental illness in similar circumstances. If offered the choice via pre-implantation genetic diagnosis, would you opt for the short or the long serotonin transporter gene variant for your future child? Or would you decline to choose, putting your faith in God or Mother Nature? Right now, of course, this kind of scenario still sounds far-fetched. Later this century and beyond, are prospective parents really going to enroll for courses in behavioural genetics and molecular biopsychiatry before having kids? For sure, certain genetic decisions are in principle straightforward, for example gender selection or whether to pass on a cystic fibrosis allele. Such decisions are taken by some prospective parents in a few countries already. But other genetic decisions will be much more complicated, not least for mood genes that help determine a person's average level of well-being or ill-being over a lifetime. For what it's worth, I personally think that taking advanced courses in behavioural genetics, or at least seeking genetic counselling, will be morally incumbent on anyone before he or she assumes the immense responsibility of having a child. But this kind of education is unlikely to be widespread for the foreseeable future. The argument presented here doesn't depend on it. Instead, in an era of pure reproductive medicine, we may forecast an abundance of user-friendly software tools to enable prospective parents to take responsible genetic decisions, as distinct from blindly taking their chances in the genetic lottery of Darwinian life. But the exponential growth in computing power can be harnessed to a new growth industry of sophisticated baby authoring software. So the average parent will no more be required to understand molecular genetics than the average temporary Windows PC user is required to understand machine code. And the parallel goes further. If it's ethically acceptable to spend hours redesigning your Windows PC desktop the way you like it, then why not at least take a few hours to make sure that your future child is psychologically and physically healthy too? Of course, such authoring tools open up an ethical and regulatory minefield of gargantuan proportions. Yet so does sexual reproduction, playing the genetic equivalent of Russian roulette with a child's life. Recalibrating the hedonic treadmill. Okay, maybe prospective parents will choose to avoid alleles and allelic combinations associated with depression or anxiety disorders or schizophrenia when they prepare to have children. But what grounds are there for thinking that the average hedonic set point of humankind as a whole will be ratcheted ever upwards? Recall that we all have a kind of inbuilt hedonic treadmill that prevents most of us from remaining extremely happy or extremely miserable for very long, though of course extreme misery can seem like an eternity when it lasts. Our hedonic treadmill tends to have an approximate hedonic set point around which we fluctuate over time. This hedonic set point crudely determines the average level of subjective well-being or ill-being that most people experience throughout a lifetime. Of course, we're all buffeted by external events, both pleasant and unpleasant, that affect us acutely for good or ill, but over time we mostly revert to a partly heritable individual mean. In some people, the hedonic set point tends to be fixed below the Darwinian average. Such people have a gloomy temperament, what the ancients would have called an excess of black bile. In other people, the hedonic set point is fixed above average. They are temperamentally optimistic. Some people's mood oscillates sharply, other people are more equable. But the current range of hedonic diversity aside, why may we predict that the typical default state of well-being of the human population is going to increase indefinitely, even after genes predisposing to anxiety disorders and clinical depression have been weeded out of the gene pool? The plain answer is that we can't know for sure, so this is speculation. Yet here is a thought experiment. Imagine that you have the option of choosing the genetic dial settings of the hedonic set point of your future child, the degree to which he or she is temperamentally depressive or happy, or super happy. To keep things simple, I won't yet consider the richer forms of emotional well-being, just normal hedonic tone, which we know is partly heritable. What average level of hedonic tone would you choose for your future child on a 10-point scale? Here, again, I'm being deliberately simplistic. On the unscientific basis of a few straw polls conducted over the years, I'd estimate that most people, if pressed, would opt for a hedonic 8 or 9. Yet a surprising number of respondents say 10. They would like their children to be as temperamentally happy as possible. Realistically, perhaps only a minority of prospective parents will initially want to have children disposed to be naturally super happy by contemporary norms, but most parents will want happy children, as distinct from depressive, moody, anxiety-ridden children. Not least, happy children are more fun to raise. Happy, resilient, self-confident children are also more likely to be successful overachievers in the traditional Darwinian sense. We needn't suppose that prospective parents care only about the happiness of their future kids. Many parents-to-be are, of course, highly ambitious for their offspring. Anyhow, on this argument, the average genetically constrained set point of emotional well-being of our species is destined to rise over time as a reflection of these individual parental choices, as tomorrow's enhancement technologies shift social norms of well-being and become the next generation's remedial therapies. The depressive realism of one century may become the effective psychosis of the next. Over time, an analogous selection pressure may be exerted in favour of alleles and allelic combinations predisposing to high intelligence, and perhaps even genius and supergenius, although here any contribution to enhanced quality of life will be indirect. In any event, over a whole spectrum of physical and psychological traits, we may predict that germline enhancement will become germline remediation as the average level of biological well-being improves across human society. As biophysicist Gregory Stock notes in Redesigning Humans, quote, "The arrival of safe, reliable germline technology will transform the evolutionary process by drawing reproduction into a highly selective social process that is far more rapid and effective at spreading successful genes than traditional sexual competition and mate selection." End quote. Thus the tempo of worldwide mood enrichment may accelerate. Critically, the genetic mood enrichment conjecture doesn't hypothesize the future existence of any mega-project to make a happier world. The possibility of such a pan-global project can't be excluded, grandiose and fanciful as the idea of some kind of hedonistic imperative now sounds. Currently only the tiny Himalayan kingdom of Bhutan officially exalts gross national happiness over gross national product. If hedonic enrichment were institutionalized and pursued with scientific rigor, then the selection pressure against nastier Darwinian genotypes would be even more severe than anticipated here. Now, personally, I advocate a worldwide abolitionist project laid down as official United Nations policy. Not least, only a global mega-project can ever extend the abolition of suffering to the rest of the living world. Ecosystem redesign, cross-species depot contraception, and eventually rewriting the whole vertebrate genome can't be achieved by private initiative. However, such a mega-project isn't imminent. Less extravagantly, global mood enrichment may be the collective outcome of billions of personal reproductive decisions made by individual parents-to-be during the next century and beyond. Phrased in the language of designer babies, the prospect of species-wide hedonic enrichment evokes sinister images, even though it promises to make the world a much happier place. Do we really want parents controlling the destiny of their future children? But we have to be careful about how we frame the issue here. Just as physical good health is empowering and doesn't determine what you do with your life, likewise being temperamentally happy and psychologically robust doesn't determine what you actually do with your life either. Like physical health, mental health tends to empower rather than constrain. Genetically hardwired mental superhealth is potentially even more empowering. It makes you psychologically indestructible. It stops you ever becoming depressed or anxiety-ridden and suffering the crippling loss of life opportunities that such conditions entail. Moreover, in the future, anybody who isn't satisfied with aspects of their core personality, and who doesn't want to use consciousness-altering drugs to change it, can practice somatic gene therapy. We won't always be at the mercy of a scrambled mix of our parents' genes as now, whether those genes have been passed on by accident or design. Future nociception, the end of physical pain. So far I've talked about the abolition of suffering, and how psychological pain can be genetically eliminated over time. But what about the terrible scourge of raw physical pain? Surely the skeptic might wonder, genes that promote pain sensitivity in response to tissue damage will be as adaptive 1,000 years from now as they are today, and as they were in the ancestral environment. So the prediction that 1,000 years hence the worst experiences that anyone undergoes will be richer than today's peak experiences sounds like a pipe dream. How is this even technically possible, let alone sociologically realistic? Well, there is a short to medium term answer and a longer term answer. Let's consider the short to medium term options first. The cyborg solution versus radical recalibration. At present, there are different natural genetic variants that promote varying degrees of pain sensitivity, e.g. variant alleles of the SCN9A gene coding for the alpha subunit of the voltage-gated sodium channel NAVL.7 in nociceptive neurons, the new opioid receptor gene, and the gene encoding catecholomethyltransferase. Few prospective parents in future are going to want kids who are hypersensitive to physical pain. Most parents, if given the choice, will presumably seek no more than mild to modest pain sensitivity for their offspring. Thus, if genetically planned parenthood ever becomes the norm, then our pain thermostats, or algostats as we might call them, are likely to be genetically reset over time too. But this recalibration doesn't abolish suffering, it just diminishes its prevalence, intensity when physical pain occurs. Moreover, as attested by rare cases of congenital anesthesia, children born without any capacity to suffer pain are currently liable to undergo all manner of life-threatening medical complications. So does this mean we are stuck with pain in some guise or other forever? No, though there are formidable technical challenges to overcome. If we are to abolish physical pain altogether, I think there are two long-term options. These two options are not mutually exclusive, but I will consider them separately. Recall how silicon, etc., robots with the right functional architecture can get by fine without the nasty raw feels of phenomenal pain. They can be programmed to avoid and respond flexibly and adaptively to noxious stimuli. Clearly there is a distinction between the physiological function of nociception and the subjective experience of phenomenal pain. They are dissociable even in organic robots like us, not just our inorganic robots. So likewise, in theory, future humans could computationally offload everything nasty or routine onto prosthetic devices, nanobots and the like, preserving only the life-enriching forms of sentience and discarding the ugly Darwinian junk. This is what we may call the cyborg solution. The main advantage of the cyborg solution in the long run is that it permits maximum lifelong bliss for all sentient life, as its ultimate adoption would seem mandatory on a classical utilitarian ethic. But assuming that we don't go down the cyborg route, there is another option. In principle, we can radically reset the scale of the pleasure-pain axis in the mind-brain. All that is needed for an organism to respond adaptively to a changing and potentially hostile environment is informational sensitivity to fitness-relevant changes, including the binary opposition, wonderful versus not quite so wonderful, regardless of the tidal range of our emotions on an absolute hedonic scale. A narrow compass of pleasure gradients can in theory play a role analogous to pain gradients in some victims of chronic pain syndrome today. This hypothesis is counterintuitive. One might imagine that if people always felt more or less super well, both physically and psychologically, then they won't be motivated to act circumspectly, and therefore they will tend to hurt themselves, whether physically or emotionally or both. Who could respond adaptively to the world if consumed by a perpetual whole-body orgasm? Yet this doesn't follow. As we know today, the happiest people, the keenest life lovers, tend to be the most motivated people. It's depressives who tend to be unmotivated. Yes, there are forms of happiness associated with indolence, for example opioid bliss. There are also forms of happiness associated with intense motivation, forward planning, and goal-directed behavior, so-called hyperdopaminergic states. Either way, our descendants, and possibly our elderly selves, will have a choice of what kinds of physical and emotional well-being they want to enjoy, and a choice of what kinds of genetic predisposition to pass on to the next generation. If you don't want to bring any more suffering into the world, then your only option right now is not to have children. In the future, however, we'll be able to have cruelty-free children with a clear conscience. That's for at least. Gradients of bliss. What's true of physical pain and depression is true of other negative states of mind. Thus the prediction that life 1,000 years hence will feel orders of magnitude better than now isn't a claim that posthumans will all be uniformly happy, or that future life will be perfect, whatever that might mean. Indeed, one can argue that discontent is the motor of progress, and that the functional analogues of discontent are likely to endure 1,000 years from now, just as the raw fields of discontent exist at present. Admittedly, it's hard to know whether 4th millennium posthumans will be allowed with anything even functionally resembling the same core emotions that define our lives today. The molecular signature of some kinds of emotion, for example disgust, panic or jealousy, might be abolished altogether, both phenomenally and functionally, whereas genes and regulatory code for novel life-enriching emotions may be customized and spliced into the genome. Our perceptual and cognitive architecture is likely to be genetically reshaped too, probably in ways beyond the contemporary human imagination. But such innovation isn't essential for an improved quality of life. The functional analogues of anxiety and depression could still persist, and yet life could always be subjectively wonderful, since it's technically possible to decouple functional role from the subjective texture of unpleasant experience, as we feel it now. Critically, I'm not arguing that our descendants will enjoy uniform bliss, and certainly not that they will be manic or blissed out, simply that their genetically constrained floor of comparative ill-being will be higher than our absolute ceiling of well-being. Continual germline enhancement across the generations will create a novel motivational system. Its mechanisms of emotional homeostasis will transcend the Darwinian pleasure-pain axis. Thanks to the unfolding reproductive revolution, there will be continual selection pressure in favour of the biology of a subjectively improved quality of life. Equating net value and net happiness in the manner of classical utilitarian ethics may or may not be simplistic, but acknowledgement of the connection between enhanced value and enhanced emotional well-being is common to a whole range of ethical systems, both religious and secular. Few ethical systems give no weight to emotional well-being. Thus, if a piece of music sounds 1,000 times more enchanting than its predecessor, or a work of art looks 1,000 times more beautiful to behold than anything physiologically possible at present, then I think the default assumption must be that such overpowering beauty is indeed a good thing, in the absence of cogent arguments to the contrary. The new germinal choice technologies allow the creation of subjectively valuable experience on a truly prodigious scale. So other things being equal, we should embrace their use. Spiritual well-being. The approach I've sketched so far probably sounds crudely reductionist. One needn't interpret super-happiness in just a narrow one-dimensional sense. Take, for example, spirituality and spiritual well-being. In future, if you are very spiritual and want to have hyper-spiritual children, then you can opt to over or underexpress the relevant genes or allelic combinations promoting a spiritual temperament, and perhaps ultimately design angelic spiritual genomes for your children. Indeed, if you want to be naturally supernatural yourself and don't want to take entheogenic drugs, then you could lose autosomal genome enhancement and add extra copies or overexpress variants of alleles and allelic combinations associated with spirituality. Secular rationalists, on the other hand, may prefer to lay the genetic foundations for more worldly well-being. To take another example of multidimensional well-being, Prospective parents may be able to choose genes and genotypes associated not just with intelligence in the simple-minded conventional sense, but with an increased capacity for empathy, involving functionally amplified mirror neurons and enhanced social cognition. Prospective parents will have the opportunity to endow their kids with an enriched oxytocin system, leading to greater trust, generosity of spirit, and pro-social behaviour, potentially with immense benefits for society as a whole. Such scenarios are, of course, speculative. A reproductive elite. An obvious question arises, won't these new reproductive technologies be solely for the rich, or at least mainly for members of the prosperous developed nations who can buy the best genes, undercutting the argument from the selection pressure advanced here? Initially, surely yes, but not for long, even assuming, and plausibly, that the world's poorest nations will remain poor indefinitely. Consider how rapidly web-enabled cell phones have spread to even impoverished sub-Saharan Africa. If personal genome sequencing always costs anything like the $200,000 it does now, then only an elite of affluent Westerners could benefit from such breakthroughs. If personal genome sequencing costs $10 or less, then effectively everyone can have it. The nature of information and information technology entails that IT-based scenarios don't involve the consumption of scarce natural resources in the way material goods do, where one person's gain is frequently another person's loss. Only a handful of people in the world can ever own a Rolls-Royce or a Maserati, and even fewer can own an original Picasso or an old master. An unlimited number of people can listen to the world's entire catalogue of music, enjoy access to all its electronic games, its computer software, its movies, or indeed the whole Library of Congress. Information is effectively free, or at least it will be soon. Later this century, reproductive technologies like pre-implantation genetic screening and diagnosis, techniques used to identify genetic defects in embryos created through in vitro fertilization before pregnancy, are going to become dirt cheap too. Already crude personal genotyping services are available for a few $100s. Of course, it's easy to sing a happy tune with the word soon. I'm glossing over a host of problems in the transitional era between old-fashioned sexual reproduction and true Planned Parenthood. Soon in this context may mean decades, perhaps centuries. But even on the most conservative timescales, we're on the brink of a major discontinuity in the 4 billion year odyssey of the evolution of life on Earth. Some unknowns. Human cloning. One big unknown, affecting any conjectures about future selection pressure, is the role of human cloning. Whether human reproductive cloning takes another 5 years or 50 years, it is going to happen. What's less clear is the cost and expertise involved when the technology matures, and what are its global implications for selection pressure. If human cloning will always take a large team of research professionals, complex medical equipment, many failed attempts and a great deal of money, then it will presumably always be rare. But if it can ever be done cheaply and safely at home, perhaps via DIY cloning kits available for purchase over the net, then human cloning could become a common way to make babies, regardless of official laws and regulations. For the sake of argument, let's suppose that human cloning does eventually become a common mode of reproduction. It's not clear this is a bad development per se, any more than identical twins or triplets are intrinsically bad. Either way, this possibility might seem to throw a big spanner into the argument from selection pressure I'm making here, since genetically identical babies are likely to suffer from the same problems as their father or mother if exposed to a similar environment. Yet it seems a reasonable assumption that most future human cloners won't seek to create exact genetic duplicates of themselves, but it will instead aspire to have offspring free of defects or unwanted characteristics possessed by their parent. To use a trivial example, a human cloner with thinning hair wouldn't necessarily want to have a cloned child with a predisposition to grow bald. Granted, most Asian people who want a clone will want to have children who are Asian-looking, and most blue-eyed people will probably want blue-eyed clones, but presumably carriers of the cystic fibrosis allele won't seek to pass on the defective genes of their cloned offspring. Likewise, for the most part, depressive people who might like to clone themselves aren't likely to want depressive children. Cases of negative enhancement, akin to the existing use of pre-implantation genetic diagnosis to select an embryo for the presence of a particular disability such as deafness shared by the parents, will presumably be uncommon. So yes, if human cloning becomes widespread, and certainly if human cloning becomes cheap and ubiquitous, then its spread makes the argument from selection pressure defended here more complex, but the practice wouldn't fundamentally undercut its conclusion. Autosomal gene therapy and enhancement. Another unknown that adds to the complexity of the selection pressure argument is the future extent of autosomal gene therapy. I've been focusing on reproduction and germline gene therapy and genetic enhancement, but somatic gene therapy is sure to become available and probably extensive in humans too. After all, if offered the choice of either taking a drug to remedy some physical or psychological defect for the rest of your life, or curing the deficit with a one-off course of gene therapy, which would you choose if you were sure that the gene therapy was safe and effective? The same is true of future enhancement technologies, where remediation versus enhancement is in my view impossible. Potential pitfalls. The spectre of coercive eugenics. Anyone uncritically enthusiastic about the reproductive revolution and prospect would do well to reflect on the history of the 20th century. In the words of bioethicist Nicholas Agar, quote, "Those who do not learn from the history of human enhancement may be doomed to repeat it," unquote. One recalls the forced segregation, sterilization, racial hygiene, the euthanasia program, and ultimately the genocide practiced in the pseudoscientific name of eugenics. Might the impending reproductive revolution lead to similar horrors? After all, there are still plenty of people in the world convinced that some races are intellectually or morally superior to other races. Might history repeat itself? The short answer is yes, though I think such scenarios are unlikely. For a start, the totalitarian dictatorships of the 20th century, monopoly of the Third Reich, all depended on censorship and a state monopoly of information. The Internet makes the creation of totalitarian dictatorships much harder. As has been well said, the Internet interprets censorship as damage and reroutes. However, this is obviously a huge topic. All I'll say here is that there is a fundamental difference between a regulatory system where eugenics, under whatever name, is practiced for the well-being of the individual, whether human or non-human, and an authoritarian society where eugenics is practiced for the notional benefit of class, race, or nation. Even so, there are clearly lots of problems with so-called liberal eugenics. For instance, there are pitfalls when prospective parents choosing enhancements that offer a merely positional advantage to their children. To give a concrete example, if parents pick genes likely to allow their child to grow taller than current average, then there is no net benefit to either the child or society if most other parents do the same. Indeed, if human stature were to become significantly higher today, then we would all be prone to multiple health difficulties under Earth's gravitational machine. Even enhancements such as genes that may contribute to superior intelligence, overexpressing or adding copies of the NRP2 or ASPM or microcephalin genes, to use a pretentious example, that sound as though they might confer intrinsic benefit, might arguably amount to positional goods like height. Thus, women tend to find intelligent, sexy, and prospective mates, but presumably what's advantageous to the brainy male bearer in terms of enhanced sex appeal is relative and not absolute intelligence. Counter to this argument might be that there are inherent benefits to high male intelligence aside from attractive. In contrast with interventions that confer positional advantage, genetic enhancements that enrich subjective well-being, crudely, whether you're temperamentally happy or super happy, would be intrinsically beneficial. They can potentially benefit everyone, regardless of where one falls on any comparative scale of well-being. Indeed, technologies that biologically enrich emotional well-being are arguably the only enhancements that are intrinsically good as distinct from positionally or instrumentally good. This claim is obviously controversial, but will be contested by many ethicists who aren't classical utilitarians. Other pitfalls? Although designer genomes can in principle lead to vastly greater diversity, might designer genomes lead in practice to greater genetic uniformity, if most parents strive to have similar kinds of ideal children, the supernormal reflections of preferences in our adaptive genetic Darwinian past. Admittedly, some kinds of genetic uniformity are presumably desirable. Just by common consent, it would be a blessing if there were no gene for Huntington's disease. But 20th century eugenicists didn't take account of phenomena such as heterozygote advantage, normally defined as cases where the heterozygote genotype has a higher relative fitness than either the homozygote dominant or homozygote recessive genotype. Heterozygote advantage explains why some kinds of genetic variability exist, most famously the gene for sickle cell anemia. Analogous heterozygote advantage may exist for psychological traits too, though this is unproven. Whatever their evolutionary origin, here are 3 examples where the issue is complicated. The future of homosexuality. Even if you have absolutely no prejudices at all about homosexuality, would you choose so-called gay genes for your future child, variant alleles that predispose your child to be gay? Now, of course, it's possible that in 50 or 150 years' time, homophobia would have been relegated to the dustbin of history where it belongs, but I wouldn't count on it. In the meantime, what percentage of prospective parents, whether straight or gay or bisexual, will deliberately choose to have a gay child, knowing the greater social problems that child would be likely to encounter in life due to social prejudice? If this is the case, if there is indeed a reproductive revolution as outlined here, then it is quite likely that genes predisposing to homosexuality, possibly even bisexuality, will be strongly selected against. They may even die out. If one looks in human history from classical antiquity to the present, at the contribution made by people whom we would probably classify as gay or bisexual, and likewise at the contribution of their close genetic relatives, then this is not an outcome to be contemplated lightly. On the other hand, it's also possible that many gay couples will use the new reproductive technologies to have gay children, rendering the gay extinction scenario moot. The future of bipolar disorder. Chronic unipolar depression may be an unmitigated evil, but what about bipolar disorder, formerly known as manic depression? Bipolar disorder can undoubtedly cause terrible suffering, both to its victims and their families, yet many creative high achievers in art, science and politics have at the very least been soft bipolars. Is there a danger that something valuable will be lost if in future prospective parents weed out of the gene pool alleles associated with bipolarity? Again, this is a huge topic. The future of autism spectrum disorders. Classical autism is characterized by varying degrees of mind blindness and deficits in social interaction, deficits in language, communication, and the capacity for social play, and multiple stereotypes of behavior. The 3 most common forms of autism spectrum disorders are classical autism, pervasive developmental disorder not otherwise specified, and Asperger's syndrome. Whereas children with, say, trisomy 21, Down syndrome, or Williams syndrome can be abnormally sociable, and therefore rewarding to raise. By contrast, autistic children with an absent or underdeveloped theory of mind commonly cause great distress to their caregivers. It is hard to bond with someone who always treats you as an object. As any genetic predisposition to autism might seem a prime candidate for elimination from the gene pool as the reproductive revolution gathers pace. However, some of the greatest scientists who have ever lived, notably Newton, Einstein and Dirac, fulfill many or all of the diagnostic criteria for Asperger's syndrome. To what extent was their scientific acumen separable from their pathologies of mind? Calculating risk-reward ratios. If there are likely to be so many possible adverse and or unintended consequences of the new reproductive medicine, and perhaps dystopian outcomes no one has ever even considered, then why forge ahead? Why not outlaw the new reproductive technologies altogether, or at least drastically restrict their use to simple Mendelian genetic diseases of the body, rather than complex disorders of the mind-brain? After all, there is no way we can computationally model all the ramifications of even modest rewrites of the human genome. Here the question comes down to an analysis of risk-reward ratios and our basic ethical values, themselves shaped by our evolutionary past. Best extension of the new reproductive medicine seemed too rashly experimental even to contemplate, it's worth recording that each act of old-fashioned sexual reproduction is itself an untested genetic experiment, the outcome of random mutations and meiotic shuffling of the genetic deck, and with no happy ending to date. So just who are we to accuse of reckless gambling? As it stands, all of us are genetically predisposed to grow old and die, and in the course of a lifetime, the great majority of humans will experience periods of intense psychological distress, for example, loneliness and heartache after an unhappy love affair. Our social primate biology ensures that most of us sometimes experience, to a greater or lesser degree, all manner of nasty states that are genetically adaptive in the ancestral environment, e.g. jealousy, resentment, anger. Hundreds of millions of people in the world today suffer bouts of depression. Others live with chronic anxiety. One might say these phenotypes are part of what it means to be human. Worse, we pass on a heritable predisposition to these horrible states onto our children. Bioconservatives, religious traditionalists and social reformers alike would contest this bleak analysis. If you believe that human life today is fundamentally good, and viciously unpleasant states of mind are an aberration that can mostly be remedied by improving society, then you will need compelling reasons before wanting to change the regime of ordinary sexual selection as it exists now. Most likely, will be loath to support anything like the reproductive revolution predicted here, and focus entirely on its potential dangers. The spectre of Brave New World will probably loom large in any discussion. If, on the other hand, you think that Darwinian life is cruel and tragic by its very nature, then you are more likely to be willing to contemplate radical alternatives to the status quo, despite the possible risks. My own view of the risks and uncertainties is that there is a critical distinction between trying to abolish suffering exclusively via social reform and abolishing suffering directly via biotechnology. As we know, utopian social experiments typically go wrong, sometimes hideously wrong, and end up causing a lot of suffering instead. The abolitionist project to eradicating the biological substrates of suffering sounds like just another utopian scheme, whether it's counted as a grandiose species project or simply as a byproduct of the reproductive revolution explored here. Although the abolition of psychological pain is arguably no more utopian in principle than pain-free surgery, it could presumably go wrong in unanticipated ways too. Perhaps we'll unwittingly create a false paradise. But if and when we abolish the molecular underpinning of unpleasant experience, and it becomes physiologically impossible for any sentient being to suffer, we thereby change the very meaning of what it is to go wrong. Unwelcome surprises when no one gets hurt are very different from unwelcome surprises where they do. For what it's worth, I think the abolition of involuntary suffering is the precondition of any civilized post-human society, and therefore a risk worth taking. The end of sexual reproduction. Okay, I've outlined grounds for believing that our nasty Darwinian emotions will be selected against in future. Yet there is a fundamental objection to the argument from selection pressure that I've sketched so far. Surely most people, not least teenagers, will carry on producing babies by having sex together, regardless of any so-called reproductive revolution of laboratory-mediated conception. Unplanned pregnancies are extremely common, even in an age where contraceptives are widely available. Yes, maybe responsible, forward-looking parents will seek to ensure that they have children who are free of genetic handicaps, who are joyful, ultra-intelligent, super-empathetic and psychologically robust, and maybe in future such responsible parents-to-be will practice pre-implantation genetic diagnosis, use germline therapy, and pursue some of the futuristic interventions described here. But that won't stop feckless teenagers having unplanned babies. In addition, billions of people may be reluctant to embrace the new reproductive technologies for traditional moral or religious reasons, or simply out of custom and habit. It stretches the imagination to envisage genetically planned parenthood ever becoming as prevalent as, say, anesthesia or guaranteed pain-free surgery. If most fertile women continue to bear genetically unenriched babies by the conventional route, then surely our inbuilt genetic tendency for all forms of Darwinian suffering is going to express itself indefinitely. Maybe so. It's a powerful counter-argument. It is a strong grounds for thinking that traditional style sexual reproduction can't continue for more than a few generations. The reason is bound up with the coming revolution in anti-aging medicine. Throughout most of human history, radical life extension, let alone the prospect of eternal youth, has been the province of quacks and charlatans. To some extent it still is. Swallowing a bunch of vitamin pills each day isn't going to let you live forever. But over the next few centuries, and possibly even before, aging and the genes that promote or allow senescence are going to be phased out. This is of course a bold claim, and I won't even attempt to defend in detail here. If you are sceptical and haven't read the book already, I'd recommend Aubrey de Grey's Ending Aging, the rejuvenation breakthroughs that could reverse human aging in our lifetime, published in 2007. Now, I'm more pessimistic than Aubrey de Grey about timescales, yet the genetic and pharmacological interventions that we are already trying in non-human animals would eventually be tried in the human animal too. One hesitates to embrace what sounds like a facile technological determinism, but I think we can say, quite dogmatically, that if and when radical anti-aging technologies become available, then the overwhelming majority of people will use them, regardless of any rationalizations of death and aging we express now. Moreover, most people will also want to use such treatments for their family pets. The anti-aging revolution won't be confined to one species. Let's assume for the sake of argument that this is the case, i.e. there will be both a reproductive revolution and an anti-aging revolution. If post-genomic medicine dramatically extends lifespan, and fewer people die of the traditional diseases of old age, then our planet will soon reach its carrying capacity. Looking centuries ahead, a rapidly expanding population of eternally youthful quasi-immortals means that human reproduction of any kind will have to become rare, and eventually a momentous event, and tightly controlled in every respect. It's here that I foresee both the greatest ethical dilemmas rising from the reproductive revolution, and also the intimate link between super-happiness, super-intelligence, and super-longevity. Selection pressure in an age of quasi-immortality. When the Earth reaches its carrying capacity, the maximum packing density of sentient beings consistent with sustainable life, there will have to be immensely greater centralized control of the human reproductive system, on pain of complete Malthusian catastrophe. This does indeed sound a truly sinister prediction. Perhaps one can imagine the existence of a mandatory regime of depot contraception from an early age. Yet could depot contraception really be made fail-safe? How would such fertility control be enforced? Moreover, the problem isn't just preventing reproductive accidents. The urge to have one's own children can be extraordinarily strong, as tested by the anguish caused by involuntary childlessness today. And for many childless couples, this yearning could eclipse any general worries about the carrying capacity of the planet. The majority of people will want both to stay forever young and to have children. If radical anti-aging technologies are indeed widely adopted, then a central and unavoidably intrusive control of human reproduction may be inevitable, but one may trust such powers will be accountable to democratic control. And in the era of mass super longevity, every intellectually competent citizen will presumably recognize in the abstract that unlimited reproduction is physically impossible. On the other hand, some people will presumably try to have unregulated, unsanctioned children, just as they do in the People's Republic of China today, albeit without the promise of eternal youth. This is not an attractive parallel. Of course, there are other social perils associated with mass super-longevity. In an era of genetically pre-programmed eternal youth, the ruling power elites may prove almost immovable in the absence of adequate democratic safeguards. But the potential loss of bodily autonomy and procreative liberty is especially troubling to the liberal conscience, and to any libertarian life extensionist. The counter-argument here is that the urge to bear children is under genetic control, and that urge will itself be amenable to biological intervention. Manipulation of our first-order desires is likely to prove biologically easier than defeating aging. Yet if most of one's enhanced fellow citizens do act responsibly, and forego or postpone reproduction, then any predisposition to cheat and have children might be highly genetically adaptive, at least in the short run. Such an outcome would be disastrous in an already overpopulated global megalopolis. Plausible group selectionist scenarios aren't easy to construct even for the far future. Hence the price of post-human super longevity is the likelihood of ever greater state intervention in the hitherto private realm, although such intrusiveness need not be subjectively distressing in any sense we would recognise today, since the functional analogue of distress might suffice. Long before any era of post-genomic medicine, Plato believed that human reproduction should be monitored and controlled by the state, a portent of totalitarian societies to come. But once we transcend the biology of human mortality, some sort of collective control of reproductive decision-making may prove inescapable even in liberal democracy. The only alternative to such control would be draconian state-enforced rationing of anti-aging therapies, a scarcely credible reenactment of Logan's Run. It's important to note that this argument doesn't turn on whether it transpires that the ultimate carrying capacity of our planet is 15 billion or 150 billion, or conceivably even higher packing densities. Yes, we can colonize the solar system. In theory, too, in some era of the distant future, the authorities on Earth would tell anyone who wants to have a child that they must do so in one of the extrasolar planetary systems that we colonize. But for the next few centuries at least, and possibly millennia, the prospect of some kind of galactic adaptive radiation is pure science fiction, for it is hard to overstate the technical obstacles to mass interstellar travel. Possibly post-humans would go to the stars, and perhaps even colonize our local galactic supercluster in a few million years or so. Realistically, this doesn't solve the near-term demographic challenge of a massively overcrowded Earth. Admittedly, I'm making a number of contestable assumptions here. I will note just three. First, intelligent life won't wipe itself out altogether in the next few decades. Doomsday scenarios are conceivable, but they are much harder to construct once self-sustaining colonies are established on other planets later this century. Second, there is a unique past and a unique future. A simplifying assumption is inconsistent with quantum cosmology and most likely false, however, consideration of the branch density measure of alternative, classically inequivalent histories in post-Ebert quantum mechanics would take us too far afield in this talk. Third, unlike futurists who believe in uploading, I am assuming that our post-human descendants will retain an organic substrate, maybe augmented by web-enabled neurochips, nanobots, bionic implants and the like, and hence that humans won't scan, digitize, and upload themselves to dwell in another computational medium where the constraints of the Earth's ecosystem don't apply. There is no evidence that your PC is any more conscious than an abacus, despite its greater processing power, and if a souped-up version of your PC contains a digitized representation of you, this would doubtless facilitate restoration from backups, but there are no grounds for thinking that such lines of code would be conscious either, let alone you. Yes, artificial intelligence will hasten the reproductive revolution, and perhaps one day we will all become web-enabled cyborgs. And who knows what kind of exotic post-biological artificial life can be evolved if and when our descendants run mature quantum computers. Yet there is simply no evidence that inorganic systems, the classical von Neumann architecture, support raw fields or intrinsically matter. The notion that our species might destructively upload ourselves from basement reality into digital nirvana is unworkable. So here at least I am being tamely bioconservative in assuming that the Earth 1,000 years hence will support a densely populated primordial meat world of our flesh and blood post-human descendants. Anyhow, to summarize, assume that the creation of new quasi-immortal beings will indeed become exceedingly rare later this millennium. The Earth will be almost literally full. I'd argue that on such historic occasions as the creation of a new post-human being, it is unlikely that super-happy, super-intelligent agents will create the genetic malware for unpleasant, stupid, senile substrates of consciousness, i.e. archaic Homo sapiens. Our post-human descendants are more likely to create fellow smart angels instead. The triumph of the reproductive revolution will have reshaped the post-Darwinian fitness landscape out of all recognition. Hence my tentative prediction that the biology of suffering, and senescence is destined to pass into evolutionary history.